So, I'd like to begin even before you, with your parents. Tell me a little bit about who they were, what they were interested in doing at the time you came into the world.
Sure. So, let's see. My father was an economist. He had a dual career alternating between the insurance industry, in which he was treated very well and was somewhat bored, and the government, in which he was treated pretty badly but was fascinated by the work.
And the direction of his work was?
His last job was that he was the economist on the Joint Committee of Congress that dealt with taxation. So if a tax bill was introduced, a lot of lawyers would focus on exactly how to phrase it and this and that. And my father tried to explain what might happen if the bill got passed.
Now, also his job would explain that he's living very near Washington, D.C., and so
Yes.
were you.
Yes.
So tell me a little bit about, well, before we go there, your mother, was
Okay,
she
so
a
my mother,
professional?
my mother was a housewife. She was born in Germany and fled the Nazis in 1939.
Wow. So a smart family.
Well,
Is knowing to get out.
a confident family. My grandfather was a successful businessman who felt that when things got bad, he could bribe his way out. And so at the last possible opportunity, he managed to do that.
Wow.
Yeah.
So she's at home, your father is working in various forms of economic strategy. You come into the world in Silver Spring.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about your family. Are you an only child?
No, I have a brother. My brother for a long time was the Dean of Physical Sciences at the University of Chicago. And when not an administrator, he's a professor of math. So math is the family business.
In the family, yes, indeed. He's older or younger?
He's younger.
Okay, so you're the first to show some mathematical ability.
Yes.
And the story is almost famous about how you discovered an affinity for math, but tell me about the age and the reason.
Sure. So I think I was about 9. Mm-hmm. I was very interested in science. I'm afraid I've told this story enough times that I tell it in the same words.
Some will be hearing it the first time.
I'm sure all will be hearing it for the first time. Let's see. I became interested in how rockets work. The kiddie explanation didn't satisfy me. I took out a freshman college physics book from my local public library and understood nothing. My father explained to me, of course you can't understand this, it uses math. Okay, can I study math? All right, so he didn't simply say, no, that's ridiculous, I'm eternally grateful. That's a very, he was very wise. So he said to me, all right, what level are you on? I'm in whatever, 4th grade.
Right.
Okay, I'll buy you a 4th grade math textbook. And I zipped through it. Maybe it took me a day or two. I then asked my father for the next math textbook. Oh, come on, you can't have read it already. Yes, I did. He asked me a few questions. Oh, yes, you did. Okay, I'll buy you the next one. And this kept on going until I got through calculus. And then...
in the course of, what, a few months?
Let me think. I'm trying to remember. It seems to me that I was 11 by the time I got through calculus.
It's just the span of age.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. Okay. So then what to do after that? My father could test my knowledge and could help me with questions through calculus, but not after that. So what to do? Well, my father had a friend whose son was interested in math and way ahead, and was being privately tutored by a professor at the University of Maryland, and I lived within striking distance of the University of Maryland. So my father investigated, and we found a professor who was willing to work with me, Jim Hummel, and I took private lessons with him.
At the age of 11?
At the age of 11-ish, yes. Yes. Jim introduced me to some of the other professors at the University of Maryland, in particular to the chairman of the department, Leon Cohen, a wonderful fellow who took me under his wing and arranged, for example, for me to sit in on first math courses and then math and physics courses at the University of Maryland. And then after a couple of years of that, for me to skip high school and enter the University of Maryland as a freshman.
I'm not going to let you go there yet.
Okay.
Although we're at the borderland, I'm going to use that often used word, a little heavy, the famous word prodigy, and ask you, what was the culture around you of being such a precocious young person? Were your peers gasping? Were your parents showing you off? Were your teachers showing you off? What was that like?
Oh, okay. So let's see. Let's see. No one was showing me off. My parents and my teachers were very concerned lest I be pushed or made to feel extraordinary pressure, even self-generated. I think they slowed down my education a little.
Wow.
My peers were very nice. Of course, my peers were first university undergraduates and then university grad students, and it couldn't be a completely natural relationship with them. But they were very nice to me, and I didn't feel I didn't feel like an alien creature.
As a humanist, I'm a little worried about the rest of your education.
Well, or you were joined in your worries by my father, who occasionally would give me a history book or an economics book or a novel and ask me to read it. And I would dutifully read whatever he asked and then put it aside and continue studying math and physics.
I did read, and maybe this was just an aside, that there was a moment, at least, you flirted with the idea of being a painter.
That's true. I took art lessons as a kid, and at some point I was trained very well. And I like the best 2 or 3 things that I produced. And so for a while, if one asked little Charlie, what are you going to do? The answer was, well, I'm either going to be a painter or a scientist. And then,
as it happened, you became a scientist.
Thank God. My talent in visual arts, to say the least, is not equal to my talent in math.
Okay, so we're on the right course now.
Yes.
We didn't deviate into painting.
Right.
I'm going to let you enter the university now at what age?
14.
14. And how was a program established for you? I mean, was this just a normal, at normal age, but a normal undergraduate?
Well, it was, I would say, heavily concentrated in math and physics, but it was in the normal range. I fulfilled the university requirements. I took 2 English courses intended for English majors. That was an interesting experience. I gather that most students consider math and physics to be the most difficult subjects to study, but I can still remember opening my report card. In those days, it was mailed in snail mail, and I remember opening the fold and seeing the lower half of a C and being delighted that I succeeded in, thank God, getting a C in Shakespeare for English majors.
So it gave you some needed humility.
Oh, Well, that gave me some needed humility. I got a lot more needed humility when I got to graduate school. So having been a child prodigy in undergraduate school, I was used to being the best and the brightest, and people were sensitive and nice and so I think I was not obnoxious. But in graduate school, I remember hearing many times, especially in the first year, sentences beginning with, "You mean you don't know?"
Really?
And so that taught me considerable
In a way, the
humility.
real beginning of your education, in the sense of knowing what you don't know.
Well, perhaps that was the beginning. That certainly continues. I mean, I suppose it's a cliche. The more the older one gets, and the more one learns, the more
The less one knows.
yeah, the less one knows. It's certainly
the decision for graduate school, I'm sure, was pretty automatic. But the decision as to where to go to graduate school, how was that shaped?
How was it shaped? I visited the 4 graduate schools to which I applied. I was given advice by my teachers at Maryland as to where to apply. I had interesting interviews. When I arrived at Princeton, actually, I got confused and missed the little local train to go from Princeton Junction to the town of Princeton, and that played havoc with the schedule. But finally,
And you are at this point 18, or
let me think. I was 17. 17. And I wonder, now let's see, why was it that I picked Princeton? I can't remember anymore. Probably.
But are you getting guidance at Maryland about next steps?
I'm sure that they spoke to me. I had fantastic guidance from the University of Maryland all along the way, from my first contact as a little kid through undergraduate school.
There's no one mentor in Maryland? I know you'll have one later at Princeton, but
Well, there were several. What I usually say about this is that although the University of Maryland was a big state school, it felt like an army of private tutors. And so I had perhaps half a dozen mentors who took very seriously exactly how my education should be handled.
Was there an undergraduate thesis to be done? Or?
There was no required undergraduate thesis, but I published a couple of papers as an undergraduate.
Let's talk about that before we get you into graduate school.
Sure.
At what age did you publish?
Maybe 16.
And what was the direction of the work?
It was mathematical logic, and so I think the way my first publication arose, there was a course in mathematical logic. We were going through a book, and the book gave an example of something or other, and the example was very complicated, and I couldn't understand the explanation. Mm-hmm. And so I thought that maybe I would construct my own example, which turned out to be much simpler than the one in the book, and also much more general. And so the professor in my logic class suggested to me that maybe I work on generalizing it and then publish the generalized version. And she helped me to find a journal and prepare the article, and it was accepted, and that was my first publication.
Well, that would certainly commend you to Princeton's attention when you applied, among other things. But having decided on and having come to Princeton, what kinds of decisions must you make in terms of intellectual specialty as you arrive as a graduate student?
Well, first of all, what to study, what to specialize in, and Princeton has a program that accords extraordinary freedom to the graduate students.
From the very beginning?
From the very beginning. So, for example, one of my fellow students decided that one semester he was interested in none of the math courses, but he always wanted to learn Sanskrit, and so he did. There was that much freedom.
Right.
So for the first year, I studied various things on my own. I talked to my fellow grad students. I didn't have much contact with any professor. The second year in graduate school, I took a course from Eli Stein, and I was blown away by that course. And so then I considered him as a finalist among the people whom I would ask. And in the end, he was my first choice. In retrospect, it should have been obvious. And he agreed.
What was his particular interest?
So his particular interest is Fourier analysis. Now let's see. All right. So I gather that many of the people for whom we're doing this know what that is, but maybe I describe a little bit.
Yes.
Okay. So so consider a vibrating string, say a piano string. It has a fundamental note and a first overtone and a second overtone and so on. And the full sound of the vibrating string can be taken apart into those components, and the components can be put together to form the sound of the piano string. Yes. That's the origin of the subject, and it has grown greatly in the 200 and some years since the vibrating string was on the forefront of research. But that's the origin. Again,
maybe a very too basic a question, but what is the nature of research in mathematics?
Oh, okay. First of all, there are problems that no one knows how to solve. There are problems that have been studied but untouched, or problems on which there is partial progress. There are problems that sound compelling when formulated, but which no one has thought of yet. Huh. There are concepts which are very useful in solving problems, or which which sound very natural and compelling when formulated, but have not been formulated yet. And all of these things interact. So by solving problems, one is led to concepts, and by thinking about concepts, one is led to problems.
Very clearly said. I understand. So again, here you are, launched in a graduate career,
right.
Certainly a future as a mathematician.
Right.
Does one toss around phrases like pure mathematics as opposed to applied, or are those irrelevant contexts?
All right. The culture has changed. When I was a graduate student, there was a very clear distinction between pure math and applied math, and I think the pure mathematicians looked down on the rest of the world, which was insane.
The pure often do.
Okay. It long seemed to me, and I'm happy to say it's now, I think, the prevailing view, that the distinction between pure and applied is completely artificial. There's a distinction between interesting and less interesting.
Yes.
And both of those cross boundaries.
But not then.
Not then.
Okay, so you were invited into or chose the world of pure mathematics.
Now let's see. I never considered specializing in applied math. Okay. If we fast forward a few decades, my current work is sort of on the fringe of applied math, but maybe we come to that later.
We'll get there. But not having considered applied,
okay.
Presumably your mentor
right.
Is involved with pure mathematics.
Yes.
So you launch into that world of analysis.
Yes.
Again, because I'm interested in the progression of your curiosity.
Okay.
Within that, how do you then set upon choosing the problems to address?
Well, I was very lucky in my choice of mentor, because Eli has had, I think for his whole career, an enormous collection of research problems at all levels, and he sizes up the student and supplies an appropriate problem. So to begin with, simply my advisor posed a question. Now, he obviously had a very high opinion of me because he gave me what was considered at the time a major unsolved problem to think about. I made very little progress on it. He gave me an easier problem, still plenty hard, and I solved it in a few months, and then he gave me another problem. It also solved in a few months. A couple of years later, I was able to solve the first problem that he posed to me. Turns out that what people expected to be true, the expectation was that it was true, but it was very hard to prove. But it turned out not to be true. It took me maybe longer than it took most students to make the transition to picking my own problems, precisely because I had an advisor with such an incredible supply of interesting questions. Yeah.
Yes. Well, how do you decide on a doctoral topic? Again, guided or?
Completely guided. So the problems that my advisor gave me were were doctoral topics. The first one would already be a thesis. All right, fine. Yes. So the feeling was, okay, great. Now you have an insurance thesis. Let's try a harder problem. Right. Oh, great, you've got that. And actually, there was a third stage. I actually made partial progress on the big one. And so those three things together were my doctoral thesis.
You are now what age?
And I am 20.
You're 20. Okay, well, some would consider this a problem to be 20 and have to now decide the future direction, but you've proven your abilities.
Yes.
Presumably you have a range of options before you now?
Yes.
What are they?
Well, so first of all, I was. It seemed obvious to me and to everyone I spoke to that I should pursue an academic career.
Right.
In the particular field of analysis that I was working in, there was one obvious place that was the best in the United States, probably the best in the world. So I stayed at Princeton for one more year as a lecturer, the most junior form of faculty, and then went off as an assistant professor to the University of Chicago.
Again, to belabor the obvious, but it's important to say it, this registered a kind of epic moment in terms of age and position.
Oh, okay, yes. So at least at the time, I think no longer. Definitely no longer, but at the time I was the youngest. No, let's see. Wait. This is all right. So I was an assistant professor at 21, I think, but I was promoted to tenure with a competing offer from Princeton when I was 22, and so when I was 22, I was the youngest tenured professor in the United States.
Of some satisfaction, I'm sure.
It felt wonderful.
And guaranteed you your future.
Yes.
I mean, that's always the critical thing with tenure.
Yes.
So your future is guaranteed at a good age, and you have many good years to then proceed.
Yes.
I'm going to ask, just at this stage, a general question, because it's either inane or comes to the heart of something. And I've never myself decided this.
Okay.
And that is the famous question about youth and mathematical insight and even genius. That in mathematics, number one, it's not unknown to make great progress at a young age. And later on, I'm going to ask you whether it's only at a young age, but we'll get there.
Okay.
Right now, you're in the right time and place.
Right.
Do you find that true, that there was something, first of all, about the world accepting the possibility of your contribution at such a young age that in mathematics this was not unknown?
In mathematics, this is certainly not unknown. In terms of the world accepting it, I'm trying to think. I think it happened once that I felt a lack of acceptance. It was that I met someone not at any university. I forget the context. I met someone who had been a professor in a medical school I'm thinking in Vienna, but I don't remember. Uh-huh. And I was introduced to him, and it was explained to him who I was, and he simply said, "This is a professor," and well, yes, it was.
The answer was yes.
Yeah.
It was.
Yeah.
So you're in a protein moment. You have a position.
Right.
You have the right to pursue your own interests.
Right.
At Chicago, what do you take on as?
So at Chicago, I was interested in broadening out. At some point, I decided after a very successful first year or two at Chicago, all right, I'm very happy about my achievements in this field of math. Let me find something else to do. I was lucky to find a problem. Actually, the problem was suggested to me. It was floating around and considered one of the hot problems in math, which was not in my field, but in which knowledge of my field was an asset, and so it was the right distance, and I worked on that and solved it. Actually, that happened twice now that I think about it. I think it's important for a mathematician, maybe for a researcher in any field, I'm not sure, to pick a succession of problems that are the right distance from prior knowledge. So if you stick with the same old stuff, you don't grow, and if you strike out completely anew, God help you. And so you have to strike the right balance. So
first, that balance in a way was provided by your mentor.
Right.
And now you yourself are trying to find that balance.
Well, so I myself am trying to find it. I still had a lot of input from colleagues. Mm-hmm. For a long time, I think I just completely followed my own interests. After a while, I think by being in a top mathematical environment, one simply absorbs enough knowledge and has enough experience to have some sort of individual taste.
I'm going to ask you again a basic question about the culture of mathematical discourse.
Okay.
Where, of course, so often the mathematician lives in his or her mind.
Oh, yeah.
For obvious reasons,
right.
Theoretically, but also there's a system of a circumstance
mm-hmm.
of interchange.
Yes.
How is that happening to the young professor?
All right. Let's see. I am going to a lot of seminars. I am talking to a lot of colleagues, listening to what they do, absorbing some of it, having fun. Part of being an assistant professor is to feel a lot of pressure, but I was promoted early enough in my career that it preceded the steady pressure. My 1 year as an assistant professor, I thought, well, gee, I'd better think of something because otherwise I won't get tenure. But
you did.
But I did, and so I think I have never felt the kind of pressure that academics typically feel in order to go through the tenure process.
The opposite of pressure is all related, which is
right.
inspiration
right.
from those around you, or perhaps even from students. I'm interested in that process too.
All right. So inspiration from students comes sometimes. I remember supervising a wonderful grad student with whom I would meet every week or two, and the the usual interaction with grad students would be, okay, here's what I've done and here's where I'm stuck. And I would think about it for a little while and say, well, why don't you try blah, blah, blah?
Right.
And the student would go off and think about it, and the process would be repeated the next week. But with this student, I remember he would say, I'm stuck on blah, blah, blah. And I would say, why don't you try whatever? And he said to me, well, yes, that's the obvious thing, but here's why it doesn't work. And so I would typically say, yep, well, why don't you think about it some more? And the following week, he came back and had overcome that and was stuck on the next thing. And I've been lucky to have some wonderful grad students, several.
So I'm now prepared for you to leave Chicago.
Okay.
And Princeton is where you come.
And I come back to Princeton.
On what terms? Again, presumably with tenure.
Oh, with tenure. So let's see. So when I accepted tenure at Chicago, already
Yes.
I had a competing tenure offer from Princeton, which they kept open for a few years.
Okay.
I gather that inspired by the case of Charlie's recruitment, tenure offers these days come with deadlines. You must accept by this date or the offer disappears. I felt internal pressure. I was spared certainly the worst of the anxiety of an assistant professor wondering about tenure, but I did feel, okay, the world thinks I'm wonderful. I should really do something.
Right.
Am I going to do something of the right level? And it took, I think, a long time for me to feel comfortable with myself.
Yes. Which is a good human trait, by the way.
I think it helps in many things.
Some time to do that.
Yeah.
Again, in this banquet of possibilities,
Yes.
which direction are you choosing to pursue in your mathematical research?
So let me see. At that time, I was, for a while, I worked on partial differential equations. I became interested in mathematical physics, a particular set of mathematical problems inspired by physics. I wound up spending many, many years on the question of why it is that many electrons and many protons under the right conditions will combine to form many hydrogen atoms or many hydrogen molecules. It's a textbook discussion in every quantum mechanics book that one proton and one electron will combine under the right conditions to make one hydrogen atom. But already, if there are two protons and two electrons, it's not such a walkover. And in a balloon filled with hydrogen gas, there are, 10 to the 28th protons and 10 to the 28th electrons. I'm making up the big number.
Understood.
And mathematically, the problem is to find a function of that many variables, or 3 times that many variables, in fact. And so even if one is given the answer to the problem, it's beyond the human mind to absorb completely what the answer is. But yet there are salient features of the answer to this very high-dimensional problem that have the significance that many electrons and many protons combine to form many hydrogen atoms or many hydrogen molecules. So I worked on that problem for a very long time. I was attracted to it because at the same time it was mathematically a deep and interesting problem, and it obviously had something to do with the real world.
Oh, so the real world is not of no interest to you?
Oh, not at all. Not at all. So I find it very attractive to work on problems that have some connection to the real world.
Some implications.
On the other hand, I don't at all feel compelled to produce work with practical applications.
Right. I understand. Is there, again, to speak very simply, a eureka moment in this process of inquiry that leads to something that you become associated
Well,
with?
there were several. The first, I think the first was that there was a particular number. It is the temperature at which hydrogen ionizes, and that one number is measurable in the laboratory, and in principle is the solution to a math problem. But the calculation of that number from first principles rather than from experiment is very daunting. So I discovered, I would say the first eureka moment was that if one could pin down that number to within a factor of 2, then I could prove that under suitable conditions hydrogen atoms form, and if I can pin down that number more precisely, hydrogen molecules will form. I then spent a long time trying to calculate that number with sufficient accuracy. I wound up getting, I think, some interesting results and making interesting progress, but I think that number to this day is not calculated from first principles with sufficient accuracy to guarantee why atoms and molecules form. So I think then in the end, the contribution from, 15 years or so that I spent on this problem was to understand on some level why it is that if you put many particles in a box and shake well, you get atoms and molecules, and so why we see atoms and molecules in nature. The preceding textbook explanations were baloney because for a very simple reason that people interested in the problem knew perfectly well, which is that electrons are what's called fermions. Again, maybe your audience will understand this very well. There are fermions and bosons, and if electrons were bosons, atoms wouldn't form, and the world wouldn't form in the way it looks now. Everything would implode.
Right.
And that's not what happens. And if you look at the usual explanation for why atoms and molecules form, these alleged explanations apply equally well if the electron is a boson. So it couldn't possibly be right.
I'm going to embrace a word that you came up with, baloney, about the wrong route, and just say how in the process of intellectual discovery do problems get stuck? Do truisms emerge that in the end have no validity?
Okay. Well, so how does one get stuck? Let me give my favorite analogy. So doing research in math is like playing chess against the devil, in which, however, you get to take back moves, but the devil does not. So in the first many games, you are simply immediately crushed. But eventually, by sheer luck, you make a clever move, and it takes, instead of the devil crushing you in 10 moves, it takes 15 moves. Oh, well, maybe this is a good idea. Why is this a good idea? Why did the devil have a little bit of trouble crushing me? Well, let's try a slightly different move and see whether it also makes trouble. Nope, that other move makes no trouble, and I'm crushed in 10 moves. Well, all right, so one begins to build up a set of ideas. In math, as opposed to chess, it's very important to look at. Well, I shouldn't say anything about chess. I play on a very low level. But in math, it's very important to look at examples. If you want to understand some big general thing, you have to try to find a little simple example in which the general idea nevertheless resides. And it can be a great art to come up with a good example, or even with what an example means, because if you pose the same general problem in different ways, then the meaning of an example changes. Okay, back to chess.
Yes.
So, all right, eventually you get enough understanding to know what an instructive example might look like, and you come up with one or a few, and you solve easier versions of the problem. Yes. Armed with that, you go back to the full problem. And there is then a middle stage between a long period of being completely stuck and an end game in which you see basically what to do, but it doesn't quite work. And then that's actually the most fun, because then there's a kitchen of ideas, and you put ingredients together and see what works. And on any given day, you can make a new discovery or realize that you overlooked something in your last month's work is baloney.
Seems to me one attribute that the chess player shares with the devil is stubbornness.
So all right. The in this model, all right. So I remember from from The Master and Margarita, the devil saying, well, consider only a very short time period, say 1,000 years. All right, maybe from the point of view of the devil, not much patience is required. From the point of view of the mathematician, one of the main qualifications for the job is tolerance of frustration.
Yes.
So you have to be, you have to continue even while being hopelessly stuck. In my case, that arises from love of and obsession with the problem of the moment.
The role of the wards in the culture of mathematics is significant, and you begin to get a number, although still shockingly young. But let's talk about what you got the field medal for.
All right. Now let me see. I think for the work that I had done at the University of Chicago and at Princeton before it, but probably not for any of the work that I did at Princeton afterwards.
Huh. But what was that? Was it?
So there were, all right. I'm going to say, but it's a speculation, because the deliberations are secret. Nobody told me. So there was one. I think there were two things that were probably most spectacular. One was called the duality of H1 and BMO, and so again, let me guess the level of the audience. So H1 is something that comes from complex variables, and so for people who don't know what complex variables means, it's one of the great achievements of 19th century math. If you look at two-dimensional incompressible fluids or electrostatic fields and flow of current, or the making of maps that don't distort angles, or various other things, all of these turn out to be mathematically the same thing. And by changing your point of view from, let's say, the making of maps to the study of electrostatics and back again, by bouncing from one point of view to another, one builds up a deep and very useful and beautiful body of knowledge that wouldn't at all have been discoverable by just one point of view. That's complex variables. On the other hand, so that's H1. I'm sorry, which did I say? Anyway, it's H1 that arises from complex variables. BMO originally arose from a study of elasticity, but maybe it's most easily explained with probability. Imagine that you enter a casino with a roulette wheel, and you're allowed to place any bets you like. The bets may be conservative, or they may be absurdly large and grow more and more absurdly large with time. And the question is, what does a conservative strategy really mean? And if you think about it carefully, you arrive at the notion of BMO, bounded mean oscillation. The oscillation is the oscillation of your fortune over time, even though, again, that's not how it was discovered. That's, I think, a natural way to explain it. And I discovered that these two ideas are different sides of the same thing. The technical thing to say is that as Banach spaces, they are dual to each other. So this is a connection between two things, each of which seemed very interesting in its own right, especially complex variables, but yet which apparently had
comes from
no connection. One of my personal satisfactions came from discussing one of the people who with one of the people who did the pioneer work on BMO, and I explained to him that H1 and BMO are dual, and he misunderstood. He thought I was conjecturing it rather than saying that I had proven it, and he said to me, "Oh, that's ridiculous, they have nothing to do with each other." And he was a very nice fellow and had no intention of putting me down, but that was his honest view.
Well, that's one of the issues in the whole question of intellectual progress. The amount of times that people hear that's ridiculous until
Right.
it is proven otherwise.
So one of the characteristics of a good mathematician, I think, is to be willing to ignore that's ridiculous. Ridiculous things are usually false, but when they are true, they are pretty good.
I'm going to now let you be the age you are now.
Okay.
You are no longer a prodigy. Cannot
Sadly,
be
no.
described as that. Certainly accomplished, but not a prodigy. What is this? And I mean this seriously, although not terribly seriously, in the question of how one thinks at a later point in life from that golden young mathematician.
How one thinks.
Is it any different? I mean, do you think differently now? Do you analyze differently?
Well, I think differently about which problems to choose. I'm willing to spend much longer on one problem. That's not a recent development.
Right.
Again, I think maybe starting in the 80s, I embarked on a 15-year project, but I'm willing to spend much longer on one project. I wonder. I mean, I'm certainly not as quick as I was, but I'm somewhat less ignorant. It's very hard for me to compare my present self with my past self because, well, it's always hard to understand any human being, and in particular oneself.
Well, then let's stay with yourself at this age.
Okay.
What is fascinating you, particularly at the moment?
At the moment, all right. I'm interested in several different things. The one that I've been pursuing the longest, in fact, about 15 years, is a notion of fitting a smooth object to data. So, let's say, as a poetic example, imagine that this room on a dark night is filled with fireflies. If the fireflies are sort of uniformly distributed in the room, there is no nice smooth surface that passes through or close to all of them, but it's conceivable because of heat currents or I don't know what that there is a nice smooth surface that passes through or close to all of the fireflies. That is actually a fundamental idea in statistics because perhaps one quantity is related to one or several others. You don't know in advance what the relationship is, but you have some data. The data are the fireflies. How do you get from the data to the relationship? Well, you guess that the relationship is smooth. It may or may not be. But if it is, then all right, find a smooth relationship that agrees with the data. And if there is no such, because the data just are in an unfortunate position and your guess is wrong, discover that. So that problem translates into perhaps a dozen technical questions in math, and they have fascinated me, and alone and with co-authors. I've succeeded in solving some of them. Others I have absolutely no idea how to crack. And still others I've made some progress on and hope to work them out. So that's one problem.
Staying with that and remembering the importance of your mentor
Yes.
to you,
Yes.
do you then distribute some of those questions to your graduate students?
Oh yes. So some of the work that I have done on this class of problems is joint work with first with my grad students, then now with my former grad students. And so I learn from them.
Is there another family of problems you're taking on right now?
Yes. Then with a friend at Columbia, with whom I'm going to Skype later this afternoon, I'm working on a series of papers about graphene. So graphene is one layer of carbon atoms, let's say, from the writing surface of a pencil. It has very remarkable properties. They are observed experimentally. They are perhaps of practical importance. Many of them, not all, many of them were predicted by back-of-the-envelope approximations. Mm-hmm. And my friend and I are working to understand a much more realistic model of graphene, taking into account that, for example, it's not actually a collection of little dots, it's more a collection of atoms and the electrons that flow among them, and to try to understand why this behavior occurs, and in fact to predict other behavior which was not so far experimentally observed. So I'm actually excited that there are a couple of teams of experimentalists working to verify some of our theoretical predictions that hadn't been made using back-of-the-envelope calculations.
So to conclude, we could go on a long time, but just to finish up, what I see is the habit of challenging assumptions.
Yes.
A kind of benign cussedness in the face of people telling you what's true or not true.
I think that's well put.
And a continuing and ongoing curiosity in your field, which I would guess is as fresh as when you were.
Oh yeah.
When you were young.
Oh yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. You're a good interviewer.
Glad to hear it.